Well, good afternoon. We are at week 7, and today we're going to talk about social responsibility and ethics in strategic management. As the text points out, the concept that an organization should consider the broader environment. Now, that means everything outside the gates in which it operates, and return something of value to it. Mostly we're talking about the outside environment again. Of course, that could be community. It could be a number of things. Is known as social responsibility. Why should companies act in a socially responsible way? The short answer to that is, and it's covered in the text, is because many decisions an organization makes affect the environment in some manner. So they must carefully weigh and must be not only carefully weighed, but must be carefully weighed so that as little harm as possible is done to the outside environment. Now, I want you to think about social responsibility in this context. And by the way, I'm not really 100% knowledgeable about the scenario I'm going to give you, actual situation. There is a case of severe environmental damage done to several rivers in Colorado, and now the rivers flowing downstream will affect New Mexico, and possibly a little later this week or next week, parts of Lake Powell in Arizona. And it was caused, from what I can gather, was caused by the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. They were doing some containment of toxic materials, either from a working mine in Colorado or from an old mine in Colorado, and somehow through negligence, they allowed these toxins, hundreds of gallons, if not millions of gallons, of toxic waste and our toxic materials to get into a creek, which fed a large river, which feeds another river, etc. Now, I only use that as an example because what my point here is, if somebody had to think about how this water, which was being held back by, I think, an earthen dam, as I remember reading in the newspaper, had to make some kind of decision about what was being done and how it was going to be done and how anybody might be affected about it. Now, it really doesn't actually fall into the realm of social responsibility, because in social responsibility, we're talking about businesses. But here is a case of an organization that is entrusted to protect the environment, and it made a serious miscalculation. And so this is what we're talking about here. Organizations need to think about the decisions they make and how those decisions will affect the outside environment. As your text points out, and as I have said in other courses that I teach, the late Milton Friedman, a professor of economics at the University of Chicago and a Nobel laureate in economics, took an opposite view. He believed that being socially responsible, an organization was not returning investment to its shareholders. Furthermore, Friedman believed this concept was flawed and at odds with stockholder interests, I should say. Today, most businesses reject Friedman's thoughts about social responsibility. Friedman actually said, and I don't remember in scanning over the text and preparing my lecture notes for this evening, that what I'm going to say is actually in the text. Something close to it, but not actually the same. Friedman believed that the only thing a corporation that was in business to make a profit was required to do was return to the stockholder his or her investment and prove that, either through dividends or something else. He did not believe in this, and that was kind of a philosophy that was known as laissez-faire economics. Well, it took on some of that. laissez-faire economics or market economics rejected the Keynesian economics, which we're not going to get into here. I don't think John Maynard Keynes ever talked about social responsibility. But Friedman didn't believe that. He didn't believe that what you take from the environment, you need to, to put back in a certain way that other people can use it. And we humans, not just corporations, but we humans have not done a very good job of trying to protect the environment. The authors, Whelan and Hunger, cite Carroll, who states that organizations have 4 responsibilities when it comes to social responsibility and being socially responsible and other things. The first is economic. That is to produce goods and services that are of value to society. Second is legal, and that's simply to follow the law and then not do anything that is discriminatory. Now, of course, we know that there are laws on the books about discrimination and no discrimination and how we hire and how we promote and how we send people to training and things of that nature. But legality really means following the law, and it does not necessarily mean taking a higher path. It just means following the law. Ethical. Now, ethical, some people like to think that ethical is following the law, and that is not the case. And I want to give you the classic example of that. Is slavery unethical? And the absolute answer to that is yes, it is unethical. However, it was the law of the land in the United States for too many years. So owning slaves was not illegal. Was it unethical? You bet your bottom dollar it was unethical. I mean, not only unethical, it's unconscionable. Why would any one human being think that he or she could own another human being and tell them what they could do and what they couldn't do? I mean, it's just beyond comprehension to most of us today. So ethical is adhering to the beliefs of society about things that are right versus wrong. And finally, Carroll says discretionary is the final of the 4 responsibilities, doing things that promote the general welfare of society. Now, note the word or the use of the word discretionary. That means that you can do it, but you don't have to do it. That's what Milton Friedman would say. Milton Friedman says, not only don't you have to do it, you shouldn't do it. Note that Carroll lists these priorities in order. So he says first is to make something of value, and then to be legal about what you're doing, follow the law, be ethical in your dealings, and then finally discretionary. So what he's saying is the first 3 are imperatives. Think about this. If you make something that's not of value, how long are you going to be in business? Not too long. And if you don't follow the law, same thing. If you're not ethical, people are going to find out about that and quit buying from you. Now, discretionary comes in, as we said. You don't have to. You should, but you don't have to. But people will see that as well. Some of the benefits that accrue to socially responsible companies are listed on page 75. I'm not going to go over them, but I think one of the things that we should look at is note the example of Ben & Jerry's. Ben & Jerry's is able to charge premium prices for its ice cream because the company is seen as being socially responsible. It gives back to society. Companies must assure that their stakeholders are on board with the stated ethical values. Remember, stakeholders is much different than stockholders. Stockholders are stakeholders, but not all stakeholders are stockholders. So we're talking about community in which an organization operates, the government that's there, and of course that would extend eventually to state governments and the federal government, suppliers, the general environment itself, et cetera. Employees, of course, I need to put those in there. So This is accomplished by completing what's known as a stakeholder analysis. And as your text points out, is usually accomplished in 3 steps. First is to identify the primary stakeholders. Now, we've already talked about these things. It's usually made up of customers and employees and community, and stockholders, etc. Suppliers, I should not forget them. I should not forget creditors as well. And of course, the government must be included in that. And it's more than one government. It's the local government, the state government, the federal government. And I would like for you to read, I'm going to give a little bit more insight to this. Note the Intel example where it produced a faulty chip. Now hold that thought in your mind. I'm going to come back to that. Computer users complained about this faulty chip, but Intel believed that since they did not sell to these customers, computer users, customers in this case, they didn't sell directly to them. They believed that those customers should direct their ire to the business or businesses from which they purchased the computer. Now let's remember, Intel makes chips. It does not make computers. And it was the computer makers, it could have been Dell, could have been IBM, because of the time frame we're talking about. I think IBM was still making PCs, could have been Apple, could have been any number of other ones that made computer. Gateway, yeah, I think it was Gateway Computer. I don't know if they're still in business or not. Several other ones used the Intel chip. Now, was the Intel chip faulty? Technically speaking, it was not. But actually speaking, it was. Now, what do I mean by technically speaking? There was a young math professor at a small liberal arts college in Virginia, and I'm sorry, I do not remember either his name or the name of the college where he was a professor. And he was using a computer and did something, and he found out that the chip was faulty when you went out about 16 places. Now, I may be wrong in the 16 places, but most people will tell you that the decimal and then 2 or 3 places past the decimal is sufficient. Some would go to 4 or 5. This was a very long number of zeros, if you will, or numbers after the decimal. So we weren't talking about 99.9. We were talking about 99.9999999 out, and that, the last 9, is where the error was. Now, if you're doing calculations, most people would tell you that that error at however far out I went is not significant. And the fact of the matter is, it's not significant. Now, to a math person, it is significant because math people like to say that math is a perfect science. I'm not a mathematician. I was never exceptionally good at mathematics once you got past some level. And so I would never argue with anybody like that. But I would say, as a normal user, that if you took it out 3 places or 4, or maybe 5 at the end, it was okay. I didn't need to go out those other spaces to satisfy myself that my answer was correct. However, this professor made his point, and then people started clamoring at Intel and saying, wait a minute here. You guys put out a bad product. And Intel's response was, we didn't sell that to you. You don't understand. You didn't do business with us. You did business with IBM or Dell or Gateway or somebody else. Take your complaints to them. And if you read that little spiel in there that Grove was actually saying, by the way, Andy Grove was very well respected, but he didn't get it. And he said that he finally got it and realized that Intel had to fix that chip. It wasn't the people they were selling to who were at fault. It was Intel. So Intel did did fix the chip. I don't know what it cost them. Cost them a fair amount of money, but had they not fixed it, can you imagine the cost, the enormous cost it would have done to their reputation? Somebody else would have jumped in, and then we no longer being seeing what we used to see all the time, Intel inside. Would have been something different. And somebody else would have, if Intel hadn't fixed it, somebody else would have jumped into the void and would have fixed it. Now, it might have been a year or it might have been 2 years, but it would have been fixed. And Intel wouldn't have the position that it had for a long period of time. It's got a lot of competition today. And of course, there's other ways that people get information. So maybe its dominance is not what it was once. But, I'm talking 20 years ago when this issue hit the fan, so to speak. The second is to ID those who have secondary relationship with the firm, as their actions could affect an organization in the long term. So you could say that Intel actually, in this case, even though I used it in the first scenario, Intel in this case actually had a secondary relationship. But nobody blamed the Dells or the Gateways or the other computer makers, not chip makers, computer makers, for the error. They blamed Intel, and rightfully so. And finally, estimate the effect any decision will have on stakeholders. Actually, I should use the word affect, meaning influence. We're not at the part of result. So, this gets into thought processes of ethical decision making, which we're going to talk about a little bit, and how you go through that. And there's a way you go through the ethical decision making process. It's the same as you go through the regular decision making process and identify the issue or problem and check the alternatives and see which alternative is going to give you the biggest payback. Find out what the consequences of the different alternatives are to the best of your ability. Implement the alternative of choice, and then evaluate to see what the consequences are. Well, you do the same thing, but then you put the ethical part in that. Ethics comes part of the decision-making process and should always be part of the decision-making process. Some argue that there is no specific guideline for ethical behavior, and those folks believe that all ethical decisions are relative. Now, relativity falls into 4 categories. Now, not Einstein's relativity. Naive relativism simply states that each person is free to make his or her own decisions and should not be bound by others' ethical views. An example of this would be not reporting cheating. And of course, we can take that to the classroom. Now, I realize we're in an online atmosphere, and we probably see less cheating, at least I like to think we do, than we would otherwise in the classroom. And so the question there is do you tell your instructor that someone was cheating? Or do you, if you're in a business, do you notice that somebody is cheating on his or her expense account? And this is sort of the atmosphere that took place at Enron, where an Enron supervisor would come up to one of his or her subordinates, and mostly his as far as I know, and would say, here's my expense report, please sign it for me. Now, let me give you an example of this. When I was in the Army and I traveled, I would turn in an expense report, and that expense report went to my boss, our superior, or however you want to, whatever word you want to use, and then he, and I might have been a couple of she's, but most time was he would sign my expense report. He verified that what I was claiming was accurate. Well, I was going to my superior. I wasn't going to a subordinate. And what's a subordinate going to say? Is this accurate? Are you putting a subordinate in a bad place? That's unethical behavior. Role relativism: do what is required by the job description. follow orders regardless. Now, that's what some of the folks in Nazi Germany did. And that was a defense that many people used when they were brought on trial after World War II ended, especially in Europe. And they would say, I was only following orders. It didn't occur to me that what I was doing was wrong. Now let's stop and think about this. Somebody tells you to break into every Jewish home, every Jewish business, and smash everything and burn everything in sight. So something's wrong about that. And yet hundreds, if not thousands of people did that. Simply because the Fuhrer said to do it. Social group relativism, believing that something is common and accepted practice. Now, this could go back to just cheating, especially padding expense accounts. Well, everybody else does it. Why shouldn't you? I give you an example of what happened to me, and it just doesn't fall into this category, but we can think about this. My wife and I frequent a market that's been open here in Cincinnati for 150 years or so. And there are food vendors of different kinds, cheeses and meat, and herbs and spices, and a lot of folks selling vegetables and fruit. And I like grapefruit and bought grapefruit. And, they were 2 for something, I forgot what they were, and picked up 8 grapefruit. And put them in my bag and paid the guy whatever it was. And I got home and discovered I had 9 grapefruit. So the next time we went back, I gave the guy the 50 cents or whatever it was, ordered to him. And he was surprised. And I said, listen, this is a trust thing. I picked up the fruit I want, and I pay you for what I've taken. I took more and didn't realize it. Here's what I owe you. Somebody else would say, oh, well, that doesn't make any difference. Everybody else does that. Why shouldn't you? Cultural relativism. Don't criticize other cultures. The old saying is, when you're in Rome, do as the Romans. Well, does that make it right? If you have a different value system, should you just do what the locals do? This goes to American businesses. There are laws on the books, federal laws, that say if you're an American company doing business anywhere in the world, you will not accept bribes. And yet we know that American businesses operate in many countries and in many cultures where bribes are an accepted way of doing business. Corruption. And yet we hold our American businesses to a higher standard. Shouldn't we? I would think so. The problem with moral relativism is that it allows the justification of any decision as long as it does not break the law. And remember, being legal and being ethical are 2 different things. It can be the same, but it doesn't have to be. Kohlberg states that people progress in 3 levels of moral development. First is pre-conventional. This is simply selfishness. You can't clean it up. Second is conventional. It's consideration of published laws and norms, laws that are on the books, and what's accepted, and actions adhere to an external code. Principled is the last, characterized by following an internal code, looking beyond laws and norms. And Kohlberg says that only about 20% of us actually ever get to that level. And so we have to think about this when we know or we see people that take principled stands. We have to admire those people because they are following an internal code. We don't have to agree with them, but we have to admire what they do because they may be standing out from the crowd, are saying, I won't follow the crowd. This is where I stand for. Corporations need to develop codes of conduct, ethical codes, for their employees. The codes clarify expected conduct, and they make clear that decisions must consider ethical implications. Now, I'm going to come back to ethical codes at the end, because I want to talk about the type of ethical codes that businesses should institute, even though we're going to talk about some other codes along in here. Ethical codes must have three basic approaches. Utilitarian approach, simply the greatest benefit that will produce the lowest harm, but this may not consider all stakeholders. Now, usually that's said a different way, the greatest benefit for the greatest number of people, but you can see that least amount of harm. Individual rights approach, avoid actions or decisions that trample or may trample on the rights of others. This is problematic because it's difficult to define fundamental rights and may lead to selfish behavior. We think of rights, and then let me give you an example of individual rights approach, or just maybe the opposite of it. The United States Constitution has the Bill of Rights, which are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And then there have been 16 or 17 amendments that have been passed since the original 10. There was only one that's since been rescinded, only one constitutional amendment that forbade citizens to do something. Every other amendment, in some way or another, either confers a right on someone or someone's, or prohibits the government from doing anything. I'll give you an example. The Fourth Amendment to the Constitution is laws against unreasonable search and seizure. I think the Eighth is against unreasonable harm. And there are other. First was the free speech, and they go on and on. The only amendment to the Constitution that forbade people from doing something, forbade us, of course we weren't around then, but forbade us, was prohibition. And it was a failure. People skirted the law and didn't care that they skirted the law. There were some people who would support the law. I'm talking about government officials now, federal government officials, who would support the law when they were out in public, but would do such things as to go into the Swedish embassy at the end of the day where they could have a drink of liquor, because under international law, they were actually on Swedish territory. They were not on territory of the United States. Herbert Hoover did that. Herbert Hoover was Secretary of Commerce at the time and later became President of the United States. Am I questioning his moral behavior or ethical behavior? No, I'm not, because that was a stupid law. You cannot legislate morality, and that's what they were trying to do. The do-gooders, my term by the way, were trying to keep the people who they thought were riffraff, those people from Southern Europe and the Irish and a few other places that didn't hold up to the standards of Northern Europe, England, Germany, etc. They're trying to change their behavior by legislation. It's ridiculous. I know I'm getting a little off social responsibility and ethical behavior, but I want to use that as a point of something we can't do. The justice approach. This speaks to fairness and equitable treatment, but it has flaws. Distributive justice, but it has flaws. But distributive justice is treated all in the same category in a like manner. Well, think about that. You can't always do that. An example that I can remember that still gets my daughter riled up. They had she and her classmates, when they were 8th grade, had taken up money and out of what they'd done to take a class trip. I think they were going to Niagara Falls, but that's irrelevant. And it came up in class one day that something, and one of the kids, I don't know who it was, one of the boys, I know that, but I don't remember which one, that told the teacher, well, we would prefer that you don't go with us. But guess what happened? She impounded all the money. They didn't get to go anywhere. Treat everybody alike? No, that was castigate everybody alike. Kavanaugh, on the other hand, says that we should solve ethical issues by asking 3 questions. Utility. Are all stakeholders satisfied? Rights. Does the decision respect the rights of individuals that will be affected? And 3, justice. Is the decision consistent with laws that are on the books? Finally, from this, before I get to the categories that I want to talk about, we have a short session here this evening. The text introduces the thoughts of noted philosopher Immanuel Kant, K-A-N-T, who espoused two categorical imperatives regarding ethical decisions. What do I want my decision to be implemented so that I would be effective? This is the golden rule: do unto others as you would do unto yourself. And finally, and his second imperative is, my actions should not disadvantage another individual. Well, I want to conclude this evening. We're going to spend about 35 minutes, usually, or 40 plus or 50, about ethical codes that organizations should develop. There are 2, or let me say it this way, perhaps a little bit better. They fall into 2 categories. First is compliance-based, and the second is integrity-based. The first is pretty easy to figure out. Compliance-based means that you're simply following the law, and you let people know what happens if they break the law. In other words, you tell your employees, if you do this, this is against the law, and you're going to suffer the consequences. You may even say you'll be reported to authorities and possible arrest and that sort of business, arrest and conviction, etc. But we're not going to do anything other than that. Yes, we're going to educate you. We're going to tell you what's on the books and what we expect, etc., etc. But the big thing here is, by having people follow the law, we're trying to avoid legal issues, legal problems. Perhaps be called up on criminal charges. Now, you have to remember, organizations cannot be brought up on criminal charges. They sometimes pay fines, etc., but it's only individuals who can be convicted, not an organization. The other is an integrity-based code, because it goes beyond the ethics codes simply grounded in legality. This is, as the textbook that I use for teaching Introduction to Business, Understanding Business, says, it's a do-it-right mentality. It emphasizes the core values of the organization, such as honesty, fair play, good service to customers. Let's take good out. Excellent or superior service to customers, commitment to diversity, and involvement in the community. These values that I just talked about are desirable. They are ethically desirable, but not necessarily legally mandatory. There is no one that tells you you have to treat people fairly in business dealings. There's an old saw, caveat emptor, buyer beware. We've gone away from that. but it was around forever. If you're a fan of a circus, especially Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey, P.T. Barnum, by the way, P.T. Barnum was a dry, he didn't drink alcohol at all. P.T. Barnum said there's a sucker born every minute, and he did everything he could to take advantage of that. And so we need to, and we've gone away from that. So we have to think about, okay, if we're going to have an ethical code, then it should espouse to a higher calling, a higher standing, set us above the law. Now, to give you an example of being setting above the law, in the 1830s and 1840s, I'm going back to slavery again. In the 1830s and 1840s in this country, the Congress, especially the House of Representatives, had passed rules. I mean, they weren't laws, rules that no one was allowed to get up and speak in opposition to slavery. And yet John Quincy Adams, who was the 6th President of the United States, and who was subsequently elected to the House of Representatives after he was no longer president and served there almost 20 years, would consistently rise to speak against slavery on the floor of the House of Representatives. Why? Adams had a higher calling. He said, as did most people in the Northeast and most people who were of Puritan background, that slavery was immoral. It should have been illegal. It wasn't, but it was certainly definitely immoral. And it was unethical for some one person to own some other person. And so he routinely did that. He had a higher standing. He talked about honesty. He talked about fairness, and a few other type things. So that's what I want to leave you with tonight. Ethical codes are wonderful. Every company should have one. I ought to clearly spell out expected behavior, clearly spell out what type of penalties will be meted out if the ethical codes are violated. But it should be more than just following the law. It should be we espouse to this particular thing. I'm going to give you something, and I should have brought this in, and I forget this every time I talk about ethics. There's a little story here I want to leave you with, and this goes to the 5 principles of Mars candies. And one of their principles was reciprocity. A number of years ago, now this goes back pretty far because the textbook I had was printed in the late 1980s when I was pursuing a master's degree, and so it was sometime prior to that. A buyer of cocoa beans for Mars went to call on a broker. You know, brokers facilitate trades and our business dealings. And the buyer found out that the broker was having financial issues. And so he struck a deal with this guy to say buy the cocoa beans that he normally bought for less than normal. Let's say the normal was $200,000 for a shipment of cocoa beans, and he said, "Oh, let's do $175,000" because he knew the guy needed the money right away. So the Mars buyer goes back to headquarters and expects to be patted on the back for his business acumen in saving Mars $25,000. Instead, he was admonished. Mars tore up the contract and went back to the buyer and said, "We're going to buy from you at the regular price, the regular agreed upon price." As Mars went on to say, Mars Company could be in the same straits this guy was in, or similar straits as this guy, and they want the same kind of treatment. And that's what we're talking about here in this ethics and in having integrity-based codes. This is what we stand for. These are our principles, and it's more than just following the law. Well, I thank you. We've spent the last 40 minutes talking about ethics and social responsibility. Thank you for your attention. I'm going to upload this immediately and hope I don't have the same problems that I had last week. And of course, as you know, I couldn't fix it because I was out of town. I didn't have access to what I needed to have access to. So thank you for your attention. I look forward to speaking to you again next week. Thank you and good night.